Marja from Sew Local Stitch Lounge. I'm going to show you how to make a vintage style change purse using a metal clasp. Here are the supplies we'll be using for the project. We'll need 2 pieces of quilting cotton, one for inside and one for out, a piece of fusible fleece, and then your pattern and instructions, as well as a purse clasp. And the purse clasp comes with a couple pieces of paper string, and these are going to help to hold the purse in place once you are at that stage to put it in. We're also going to need some glue, and that's what the skewer is for, to put the purse into the clasp. Your thread, pins, we need pliers also for the clasp, and scissors, of course, and I think that's everything. Let's start by cutting out the paper pattern. And once we've done this, we're going to cut out 2 each of each fabric and 2 of the fusible fleece. So when you're cutting out your fabric, make sure that you cut right along that line of the pattern, because it's really important that this piece fits into the clasp perfectly. Hold on to your scraps of fusible fleece. We can use these to protect the clasp when you use the pliers on it. The next step is to iron the fusible fleece onto the back of your exterior pieces. One side is fusible of the fleece, and you can tell by just touching it. It's a rougher side, it's a bit bumpy. That's the glue. So we'll put that against the wrong side of the fabric, and it's always easier to iron on the fabric. So you just put that down and hold it. And just keep ironing until it sticks. Now we need to transfer those dots onto the wrong side of both pieces. So this is how I'm going to do it. Get a pin and poke a hole where that dot is, and just make it a little bit bigger. Now place the paper on the wrong side, so it's going to be against the fleece, and you can just put your marker or your pencil right in that hole. So you need to do the dots on one of the exteriors and one of the lining pieces on the wrong side. So we need to put the 2 lining pieces right sides together and the 2 exterior pieces right sides together, and you want to have the piece with the dots facing up. And we'll just pin those together. Now we're going to sew from dot to dot in the lower part of the purse on both lining and exterior, and we're going to be using a 1/4 inch seam allowance starting with that dot. And now it's really important to not sew above this dot. You want to start right here, but you also need this to be pretty secure, and you want it to be either back stitched or a lock stitch right there. So I really like to use the lock stitch button on my machine for this part, because then I know I'm not going to back stitch farther than the dot. So my lock stitch button looks like this bullseye right here. If you don't have one of those, you can just back stitch very carefully so that you don't back stitch farther than that. So both of the bottom parts are sewn. Now we're going to just press those seams open This might seem a little awkward, but you just kind of stick the nose of the iron in there. It will just help the purse to sit better. I'm going to trim the seam allowance down in the curves. Next step is to sew the top parts together, and to do that we open both of the purses and put them right sides together. So you have this. We'll carefully match up, so all the dots should be basically matching up. And the top curves should meet. So we're going to sew the top section from dot to dot all the way around, basically continuing that seam but not going past the dot. So I find it much easier to sew from the center down to the dot, then flip it over and start from the center down to the dot again, because it's harder to start at the lump and it's harder to control when you stop your seam. So this is a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and be super careful with your curves. Take it nice and slow. Now we're going to do the second half. This is the seam we just sewed, the top half of one side. So if you can flip it over, you'll see that there's still half of the purse open. And we're going to sew this the same, except we're going to leave a space for turning the purse all the way right side out. And don't make it too big. I'm gonna do it about maybe just over an inch. So this is the top half of the second side. So I've got a little hole up here so I can turn it. And this is what it looks like. Before we turn it, I'm just going to trim the seam allowance a little bit. Don't trim too much, because if you have to redo any of these seams, you want to have a little bit of space here. And definitely don't trim in your opening. And now we'll turn it right side out. You can stuff the lining down inside. Hold those seams right up to the edge. Now you're going to test it out in the clasp. So it's going to fit better once it's ironed, but this is just sort of a preliminary check just to make sure it's not really badly off. If the purse was way too small, then you'd have to take some seams out and make it a little bit bigger. But basically you want that to be able to slide into the clasp and fit in there. And now I'm going to iron it. Fold the seam allowance in. Now we're going to stitch around the entire opening all in one go. very, very close to the edge. Let's start close to the opening. I'm gonna turn the purse inside out right now, just to make it easier to get into that V shape on the edge of the seam. Pivoting at the seam. Just going to cut a little piece of that and squeeze a little bit of glue out right here. It is recommended to use this in a well-ventilated area. So you can do one last check on your purse, make sure it fits in. And we're gonna have the clasp open. Doesn't matter what side you start with, but I'm gonna grab a little bit of glue and just slide it inside the clasp. You want to try to be neat with it, but it's hard to because it's very viscous, but you can wipe it off of the metal bits after. And I find the fusible fleece is really good for wiping it off. Just make sure you use a clean piece. Now I'm going to slide one side of the purse in. Now is where you're going to take one of your paper string pieces and stick it inside one of the lining, from the lining edge. So I found it easier with this clasp to have it closed, or at least somewhat closed, because if you open it, it's pulling the purse out of it. So now I can stick the string up in there. And it just fills in the space. I've got one side in, so now I'm going to pinch down in the corner. That's the only place we need to squeeze it. I'm going to pinch the other side. Right now, you can wipe off more glue if you have any more glue. And then just let it sit for about 15 minutes. So this glue fully sets in about 72 hours. So it's best to just leave the clasp open slightly, not all the way open, but just open a bit, because then that way there's no pulling on the purse at all. But just let it sit like that at least for 24 hours and then see how it is.